Now, Thomas and I are going to welcome Professor Mark Scott. He is the professor of practice at University of Arkansas. Hey, Professor, nice to have you back. And what's going on? What's on your mind, my friend?
Nice to be back. Really nice to be back. Good to see you all. And interesting times in the markets. Interesting times in the markets. That's what I would say for sure.
Yeah, this is one of those times where, interesting is cool sometimes, but this is one of those times when you kind of want to say, things are kind of boring, right? Boring's a little bit better than what we potentially could have as interesting. Is that right?
Yes, very, very, very correct. I think what we're seeing, my view is what we're seeing in the truckload market, some of the softening we're seeing with spot rates. I think if particular factors market factors persist, there could be some issues for carriers in terms of exits, in my opinion, right? It would depend on if some particular factors sustain, but I think the softening of markets that we're seeing, depending on the direction it takes, I think there could be some implications for carriers. I do.
I think there's a bunch, that kind of brings a great point, Dr. Scott, is that the implications for some of these carriers and then some of these pressures being put on them. From what you've been researching, in your experience, is there something, maybe a particular thing we should be especially worried about given the current market changes?
Well, what I think is the softening of the markets are going to impact, it's not a monolithic issue at all. I think it's going to impact carriers in very different ways, or has the potential to impact carriers in different ways. So there are particular factors at play. I would say primary among them are diesel prices and operating expense prices. And I think that if diesel prices continue to rise and that rise in prices continue to impact rates the way that it is currently, then what I think can happen is that we would see potential issues, operating and profitability issues with particular types of carriers. But I said it's not monolithic, from my opinion. So what I believe is there are two segments of carriers that could be impacted. First, there's a vast difference in operating expense between the large carriers and the smaller carriers, right? And then I truly believe that what we're also going to see is volatility or movement in rates are going to impact carriers that entered the market post 2021 more than it would impact the carriers that entered the market pre 2021. And there's lots of moving parts there, depending on what you will want to get into. But those are the things that I think at a top level we should look for. How diesel prices continue to rise and how sustained that rise is. There has been inflationary and interest rate impacts on operating expenses, particularly equipment, maintenance, insurance to a lot of an extent, but wages. And I think those things, those two, combined with particular market demand and supply factors, are causing us to see something that, in my opinion, are a little different than what we're going to see moving ahead than we did in 2019.
All excellent points, Doctor. And what I would like to discuss with you a little bit here is the impact of the growth in freight over the last couple of years has caused there to be an extraordinary boom, right? It's almost like the gold rush, okay? It's almost like, right? I mean, we had 20,000 operating authorities in 1 month come online, right? And so these extraordinary pressures that came there, along with the double or triple the price or banknotes on some of this used equipment, it could exacerbate numbers and cause a bloodbath or something that looks much worse than we've ever seen because of that positive reaction that we had earlier. Would you agree with that?
You know what? I would say that the extent of the exit or capturing it as a bloodbath, we would see what it comes to directionally. I agree with it. So the extent of it It's early to call the extent of it. I think it's going to depend on rates. So, like, real quickly, what I think is as rates begin to get to $2.40, I believe we're going to start to see a lot of pressure on entrance post 2021.
Sure.
I think as they get to $2.10, I think a broader set of carriers are going to feel it, right? So I truly believe, Michael, there's a back and forth as to
Sure.
how pervasive this thing would be, but directionally, I do think we are going to see some form of exits. The other thing that's interesting is historically, and this is fact, there are strong correlations between an increase in the price in diesel and a decrease in smaller carriers in the market. That is just what data and studies tell us.
Yeah, I watch Doctor as a kind of a follow-up. I watch the contract rates versus the spot rates, right? And when those cross, when those flip, there's this floor that hits where that bottom apple finally falls out, right? And that acceleration and exit and bloodbath starts to occur because now you've got the desperate souls out there starting to set the pricing in the spot market. And that can start to bring everything down. And depending on the seasonality of that, right? If it's later in the year when most bids start to come out, it has more of a negative impact on contract rates from the carrier's perspective. Is that something that you watch as well?
Yes, I do. So one of the things that I find particularly interesting that I'm taking note of is I've started to look at a lot of the data regarding route guiding performance. Because what I'm seeing in the spot market, one of the signs, in my particular opinion, is looking at route guiding performance measures, particularly first tender acceptance rates currently, as well as routing guide depth. And the interesting thing that has begun to happen now, none of it has been excessively decreasing, but first tender acceptance rates have started to climb, right? And they're increasing.
Right.
Interestingly as well, routing guide depth numbers are starting to decrease. And what that is telling me is why we're not seeing it flagrantly as we are in the spot market. In my opinion, we are starting to see in some particular sense a sentiment in the contract market. Again, contracts are up, right? So it's not, we've seen a lift in contract rates. We know the spot is going to set it, but I think I am looking at routing guide performance numbers, and I think it chimes. In addition to what I'm looking at, I would share that one of the other things I get the privilege to do is to have very consistent meetings and workshops with folks that are engaged in the industry themselves. And the number of meetings I had this week concerning this particular issue, whether it be manufacturers, specific retailers, service providers, they all tend to corroborate with what I just shared with you.
Nice.
I think that's a great point. In my experiences, once rates soften, contracts and freight, like you said, is one of those things where there's not really an enforceable mechanism. And so almost, do you feel like looking through that and who's getting the loads tendered, could that possibly be a great example of maybe you'll start catching customers using that service level, and I'm just going to tender it to my secondary or tertiary, and that is a way of saving money maybe perhaps. Is there any potential for like that kind of behavior as they try to save costs?
I think there is potential for that type of behavior. I think there is. One of the potential moderators of that behavior, again, in my opinion, are other broader macroeconomic and economic factors at play, right? One of the things that is happening is buying behavior has changed. And one of the things, particularly over the past 2 years, that has occurred, or I believe has occurred, and there's sentiment towards this and some confirmation of it, is that both at the firm and consumer level, there was a forward buy of the demand curve, right? And that forward buy of the demand curve led to this pantry loading effect that is going to impact replenishable orders in inbound replenishable orders, which are going to impact volumes in the market, right? So I think to see some of the dynamic you spoke to, I agree with it, but I think it depends on the volume of freight that needs to be moved. And I think there's impact to the volumes of freight.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That impact and that aggressive or intentional waterfall effect within your own routing guide is a very, very real thing. And I think one of the biggest costs, in my opinion, and what I've seen before, one of the biggest drivers of that is that differentiation between spot and contract rates. When it gets to a certain point, no longer are they taking care of the big dogs that took them. They've got to go after those cost savings that happen. Real quick, Doctor, what about the ideation or the behavior of those that set the policy and we've seen the predictable behavior of that corporations take, shippers and carriers alike, as we go through these fluctuations? Has that changed over the course of the last 2 years? Severely different markets have occurred, and so there's been a great amount of learning and some very, I would say, change in direction or change in perspective from people. Is that something we need to account for in when we're trying to predict what is going to happen next or looking towards the future?
Policy changes.
Yes.
Policy. Yes, I think it is something that we need to cater to. I think the particular types of policy initiatives are going to determine which particular direction we go to, right? So there are particular types of conversations around for instance, this one is more what I would say quasi-conceptual, but it is actually gaining some momentum, right? And that is conversations around the sharing of information on roads and the sharing of information on just business measures across shippers, across carriers to facilitate increased throughput or to address congestion. It is my opinion that while that be good conceptually, I think the industry is fragmented enough. Competitive dynamics are embedded enough that I'm not sure how feasible that is. I'm not sure if that does occur. I don't think it's feasible. I don't think it's feasible.
Gotcha. Excellent stuff, Doctor. We look forward to seeing you again very, very soon and speaking with you. Maybe when we're in Northwest Arkansas here in the next month, right?
We look forward to you joining us here, and it's an amazing ecosystem, and look forward to speaking with you all.
Absolutely. I can't wait to get you on stage and we'll call the hogs together, my friend.
We'll get that going. We'll get that going for sure, Michael. Always a pleasure to see you all.
Absolutely. Take care, sir, and have a wonderful weekend. Right now, Thomas, I think we should toss it over to a quick break.